Chapter 11. The Flood. Daggy did not see his new friend, Ike the otter, the next day, because overnight the weather, which controls everything in the country, changed completely. As Felicity had said before the race, they hadn't had rain for a long time, but not an hour after the otter had slipped away upstream, the heavens opened and proceeded to make up for their stinginess by such a display of generosity as none of the animals had ever known before. It rained. It rained heavily all that night and went on without stopping for 2 more days and nights. The sows in their sties kept to their inner compartments, venturing into their soaking outer runs only for food. The squire, of course, was dry under his veranda roof, but the constant stream of water flowing across the yard from higher ground worried him. He was not concerned for himself, but he couldn't help thinking about the strange son of whose existence he had just heard. He hoped that that existence would not be ended in an untimely way, for he knew that boys will be boys, and this one sounded particularly adventurous. The brook will be swollen, thought the squire. I hope the poor kid stays on dry land. He spoke to the servant about it, but the pig man, more hideous than ever, in yellow oilskins raincoat and rain hat, was too stupid to understand his master. At number 1 and number 2, Mrs. Trowlicker and Mrs. Boltapple stood upright at their front doors and looked anxiously over the yard. It was covered with a stream of fast-running water, as indeed were the outer runs of all the pigsties. Only inside, where each pig had raised a wooden platform 6 inches high, was there still a dry space for them and their piglets. Mrs. Trowlicker spoke first. I don't like it, Mrs. B, she said in a worried voice. I've never seen rain like this. What can we do? I'll be butchered if I know, said Mrs. Boltapple, if only the rain would stop. But the rain did not stop. On the contrary, even as they spoke, it began to come down heavily again, and the ladies hastily retreated indoors. The pig man stood at the door of his shed and looked down at the water, now almost over the lower of the 2 concrete steps. Behind him he heard rats squeaking among the bins, and his red face grew redder at the sound of his enemies' voices. But even as he turned to reach up for his hardwood stick and do battle, a big male rat came running out of the gloom of the shed and scampered right over his boots and out the door. It fell into the water and swam rapidly away, and as the pig man watched, open-mouthed, half a dozen more rats of all sizes dashed past him and into the water and away. Something he had heard long ago, at school perhaps, came into his mind. A sinking ship, he thought. Rats leaving a sinking ship. At that instant, the westerly wind, which had been blowing hard from the sea far down at the foot of the valley, dropped for a moment, and in the ensuing lull, the pig man heard a sound from the other direction, from the upper eastern end. It was a muttering that grew to a grumbling, that grew to a mighty rumbling. Straining his eyes through the driving rain, he stared back at the brook to where it curved into view around some trees 2 fields away. Suddenly, to his horror, he saw a great wall of brown water coming around this bend, and he knew in a flash what must have happened. The gates have gone, thought the pig man. The mill ponds burst, and for once in his slow lumbering life, he acted quickly. He grabbed a sack of pig nuts, jumped off the steps of the shed into the 6-inch deep water, and splashed his way to the pigsties. He flung open door after door. Mrs. Trowlicker's, Mrs. Boltapple's, Mrs. Sweetchopper's, Mrs. Swiller's, missing the empty number 5. Then Mrs. Gobblespud's, Mrs. Maze Munch's, Mrs. Gracegrass's, Mrs. Grubguzzle's. As the sows and the pig litters ran out into the yard, he blundered across it to the store pens and fattening pens, throwing wide door after door, till 150 spotted pigs of all sizes were stampeding in the rushing flood. Only when he had opened the last door of all, the squire's, did he allow himself one fearful glance over his shoulder. The wall of water was halfway across the last field in front of the buildings and coming at the speed of a galloping horse. The pigman, like all his humankind, knew that pigs are the most awkward animals in the world to drive, so he did the only thing he could, handicapped though he was by his bulk and his boots and his long yellow raincoat and the sack of pig nuts. He ran as hard as he could toward the gate that led to Rest Haven, shouting at the top of his voice the pig keeper's universal feeding call. "Pig, pig, pig, pig! Pig, 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 pig!" he yelled amid the noise of the rain and the renewed wind and the thundering of the watery threat behind them, and he pounded desperately toward the high ground at the top of the little triangular field. And behind him rose two waves. One was white spotted with black, and one was brown. One squealed with fear, and one roared with menace. One was moving as fast as it possibly could, but a pig cannot gallop half as speedily as a horse, and the other wave, the water, gained and gained on the first. As the last and slowest piglet struck the rising ground, the first and fastest wave of the flood was less than a sow's length from his curly little tail. Then the flood turned before the hill and swept across the lower slopes of the field, smashing down the old oak tree from the place where it had stood for 300 years and carrying it away like a matchstick. 20 feet above Daggy's takeoff place on the high bank went the oak, twisting and turning and thrashing its old arms in agony on its road to the windswept sea. But the pigs were safe. Not just all 150 of them, but all 153. For the first thing the pigman saw when his pounding heart and bursting lungs had quieted a little was a group of 3 figures standing at the very topmost point of Rest Haven and staring at the great army of pigs covering the high slope. Old Sal from number 5's all right then, he thought, and that horrible little piglet, though heaven knows what one of my ducks is doing with them. There was noise all around them as they stood and panted on their hilltop refuge. The blustering shout of the wind competed with the menacing roar of the brook that had become a great river. On the waters of that river hissed the lash of the never-ending rain. At one moment, Daggy imagined he heard, far out on the flood, an excited, fluty whistle, as though someone were actually enjoying the storm. But suddenly, clear above the other noises, was heard a sharp cracking sound, and from the hill 155 heads turned, and 310 eyes looked back toward their homes they had left behind, to see the beginning of the first voyage of a strange craft. The rats had been right to go, for the cracking noise proclaimed the launching of the pigman's shed as the flood lifted it bodily from its foundation. Past the drowned sties it came, over the submerged field gate, and out into the center of the great expanse of dark, sliding water that now stretched before the watchers. Its shed door hung open, as the pigman had left it when he ran to rescue them, and as the shed spun slowly in the current, he could see within it the great bins of barley meal and middlings and flaked corn, and the piled sacks of pig nuts, all sailing swiftly away to be food for the fish in the sea. Another story came into the pigman's slow mind from distant days in the village schoolroom. Looks like Noah's Ark, he thought. Trouble is, we aren't on it, and all the food I have for them is this 50-pound sack of nuts. Still, they won't be short of water to drink. He went to the topmost point of Rest Haven, and opening the sack, threw the pig nut food far and wide over the small triangle of field that was left high and dry. Within half a minute, everything was eaten, and the pigs were squealing for more, while far in the distance, the shed sailed on downriver. The pig man folded the empty sack, placed it on top of an ant heap, and carefully sat down on it. He sat motionless, his head in his hands, while the pigs jostled and rumbled below him. If there had been anyone on any of the other hilltops nearby, it would have seemed a strange sight. Above, the bright yellow spot of the man's raincoat and rain hat. Below that, the spotted throng of pigs, and below them, the chocolate-covered flood, darkening from milk to plain as the daylight faded. Mrs. Barleylove and Daggett and Felicity all stood together. "Poor old duck man," said Felicity the duck. "He looks all in." "Duck man?" said Daggy absent-mindedly. "Oh, you mean pig man? Yes, he does. Still, he's a good and faithful servant, you know. He did his duty." Felicity had also been thinking of the story of the flood and Noah as the ark-like shed had drifted by, but being better educated than the man, remembered more of it. She began to make the quat-quat-quat-quatting noise, which Daggy now knew well was her way of giggling. "What's the joke?" said Daggy. "I was thinking of a story," said Felicity the duck, "in a book called the Bible, about a man called Noah." "Why?" said Daggy. "Is Pigman like Noah?" "No," said Felicity. "More like one of his sons." "What was he called?" asked Daggy. "Ham," said Felicity happily. End of chapter 11.